Mama don't allow no architecture around here. Mama don't allow no architecture around here. Oh, I don't care what Mama don't allow, gonna draw mine modern anyhow. Mama don't allow no architecture around here.
Welcome to US Modernist Radio. Join hosts George Smart and Frank King as they talk and laugh with people who enjoy, own, create, dream about, preserve, love, and hate modernist architecture, the most exciting and controversial buildings in the world. Show your support by visiting US Modernist's massive archives at usmodernist.org or on Instagram at Mr.Modernism. Today, US Modernist Radio welcomes author Adele Cygelman and modern preservationist Christine Madrid French. And now, the guys you don't want picking your paint colors, George Smart and Frank King.
Hey, welcome to the show. I'm George Smart, and it's great to be back for a second year of US Modernist Radio.
And I'm Frank King. Support for U.S. Modernist Radio comes from the Trump administration. That can't be right. No. From Moho Realty. Are you having a hard time finding or selling a modernist home? Are you tired of dealing with people that clearly aren't into iconic architecture? Sarah Sonk of Moho Realty is a real estate agent who gets modern like you do. She loves a modernist style, and you will love the expertise, experience, and track record to close your deal. You can find her at mohorealty.com or 919-601-7339.
If you've ever seen a spy movie, you may have noticed that the bad guys have impeccable tastes. The classic villain has custom-tailored suits, or dresses, let's not be sexist, a high-end car you can't even buy used at CarMax, a British or vaguely Russian accent, and a gorgeous modernist house, preferably with a killer view, as there certainly will be some killing going on at some point. So today's show is all about Evil Lairs, the tricked-out homes no self-respecting villain intent on world domination would be without. Our guests are two expert authors who have written about some of these infamous houses, both real and imagined. Adele Cygelman was editor-in-chief of the Robb Report collection and senior editor at Architectural Digest, both of which surely had Ernst Blofeld as a subscriber. She is the author of Palm Springs Modern, the first book to focus on desert modern architecture and its talented architects. The book has been a bestseller since 1999 and was reissued in 2015 to appeal to a new, younger demographic, which excludes Frank and Tom.
Hey.
These folks, thanks to Coachella and Stagecoach, have discovered the timeless, cool appeal of mid-century modern. Adele spoke at Modernism Week this year on Arthur Elrod, who you'll learn about shortly. Christine Madrid French is a nationally known advocate for the study and preservation of American architecture. After working as a historian for the National Park Service, she directed the Modernism program for the National Trust for Historic Preservation and taught at the University of Florida and the University of Central Florida. I consider her 10-year fight to save Neutra Cyclorama in Pennsylvania one of the heroic legends in preservation, even though the bulldozer ultimately prevailed. Her new book, Critical Insights series Alfred Hitchcock, will be out soon. Chris was on one of our very early shows, and it's great to have her back. Chris and Adele, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
So, Adele, who was Arthur Elrod, and how did he come to be a household name in Palm Springs?
Arthur Elrod was an interior designer who arrived in the desert in 1954 and hit the ground running with his first commission, which was the house for Lucille Ball and Desi Arnaz, and they never looked back, he and his partner Hal Broderick. So for 20 years, he ruled the desert as the interior designer of the day. And of course, in 1966, he approached John Lautner to build his own house, which everyone knows as the Elrod House.
And Diamonds Are Forever.
Well, it was, you're going to have to forgive me because I kind of lost the plot points by the time the house showed up, but this was where Willard White was being held. Was it Blofeld's house? I don't remember.
I think so.
Sorry. He had spent some time in Palm Springs in the late 40s, so he had made some great connections. And when he came back with his partner, Hal Broderick, Lucille Ball and Desi Arnaz was the first house they worked on, and then Hoagie Carmichael's house, both at Thunderbird Country Club, which was the place to be then. And once you get a foothold, he was charming and very sociable and handsome and made great connections with everyone. Palm Springs was a village in the late 40s.
Yes.
And so he became, king of the desert. He became king of desert design because he was very personable. And he also brought this sense of modernism to his interiors, which were then being decorated in, quote, French provincial, unquote, style back then. That was sort of considered the height of fashion. Lots of gingham curtains and heavy brown painted white furniture. So he was really a breath of fresh air.
Was modernism his particular trademark, or did he work in a whole variety of styles for Palm Springs residents?
I think that at the beginning it was this sort of French provincial meets a sort of contemporary lighter version. But when he opened his showroom in 54, he had the exclusive representation for Widdicombe Furniture, and they represented T.H. Robsjohn Gibbings. And so Elrod was very instrumental in bringing Robsjohn Gibbings furniture to the desert. And he also represented Dunbar and Baker. And those were sort of fairly contemporary lines at the time.
Now, the Elrod House in Palm Springs is a real house. It's still there. I believe it changed hands earlier this year.
It did, for something like, I think there were a lot of 007s in the price, like 7.007 million. And it sold to a fashion designer named Jeremy Scott.
Okay. Now, other houses that have been owned by villains in movies are not real. The Van Damme house in North by Northwest, Hitchcock's famous movie, was not a real house, right, Chris?
Right. That was completely invented, but people still ask to see the house when they go visit the heads there.
At Mount Rushmore.
Yes, at Mount Rushmore.
So how did that house come about?
There are stories that I'm still following the lines of, but the house was designed by an architect named Robert Boyle, and he actually worked with Hitchcock on a number of structures. The rumor is that Hitchcock initially asked Frank Lloyd Wright to design a house for him, but that Frank Lloyd Wright was charging too much and Hitchcock didn't want to pay that. So I'm not sure if that's true yet or not. That's so far it's more of an oral history. But what Hitchcock was looking for was a place to house the villain. And he found it with what Robert Boyle had created, which is based on a Frank Lloyd Wright, sort of a John Lautner-like house.
That house was really stunning, as I recall from the movie.
It had a hell of a view.
Yes, definitely. And that's part of what I was found out about Hitchcock. When he decided to house the villain in a modern structure, it changed forever, really, how you see modern architecture in the movies. Now when you see a modern building, the villain always lives there. It's not the good guy, it's the bad guy. It's always the evil person that lives in the modernist house. So why is that? That's the question that I started with.
Right. You don't see the villains in the French Provincial or the Colonial Revival, do you?
No.
And I guess they're only there when they're not on their yacht.
Yeah, exactly. Well, in the old days, the beginning days of Hollywood, and even going back to Edgar Allan Poe with the fall of the House of Usher, the houses of the villain, in Dracula in the 1930s, was always a big cobwebby castle on the hill and, very Gothic looking, very scary, haunted mansion kind of a thing. And Hitchcock completely turned that on its head and instead put the villain in a modernist house. And I think what he was trying to do is show that the villain basically has no material connection to anything like that. But also the houses are always overlooking a valley, which is very much the modernist idea, the Elrod house, for instance. And I think that's that panopticon experience, which means you can see everything from one position, so that the villain is then presented as someone who is omnipresent, who can see everything from his lair, basically.
It's a different kind of lair than, say, the Bates Motel, right?
Classier.
Right. So I do write about the Bates mansion in the motel, which is obviously a completely different thing. It's going back to that sort of haunted, Victorian house on the hill. But even with that one, with that Bates mansion, the interesting thing is that movie Psycho, released in 1960, is almost 60 years old itself. But still, if you show a picture of a mansard roof mansion, the first thing people think about is Psycho, even if they've never seen the movie. So the pervasiveness of this image really has stuck in the culture.
Yes, I would think so. I mean, anytime I see a haunted house, I think of the Bates Hotel. And it seems like that anytime you go to a haunted house thing in a town, they've got some image of that thrown up.
Definitely. But so now it's different. So what Hitchcock did was take this and in that image in his other movie and put this villain in a beautiful modern house. And you can see direct comparisons to Falling Water in Pennsylvania, which of course is one of Frank Lloyd Wright's greatest residential designs.
Adele, how did Arthur Elrod and John Lautner meet?
No one's actually sure, but Elrod had very good relationships with a lot of the modernist architects working in Palm Springs at the time. His career paralleled the rise of the village and its, transformation into a very sophisticated resort at the same time that all of the architects like Stuart Williams and William Cody and Albert Frey were working. He was like, his trajectory paralleled theirs. So he probably knew of Elrod. He spent a lot of time in Los Angeles. He was, spent half his time here in LA, having all his custom furniture made, and he had an office here for a long time. So I'm sure they crossed paths. But by the time he bought the land on the top of Southridge, I think he was ready for something completely revolutionary, something that maybe the Palm Springs architects he didn't feel could give him, and he just wanted to go on a completely different path. But I loved Chris's comments about being at the top of the hill, because that's exactly what the Elrod house is. It's on an area of Palm Springs called South Ridge, and it's called South Ridge for a reason. It's a ridge. And it is the southernmost part of town. So when you get to it and you're up on the ridge and you turn around, you have the entire city at your feet.
Now, nearby is another Lautner house, the one he did for Bob Hope. Did that come before or after the Elrod house?
Oh, that definitely came after. The Hopes visited his house. They would have tea there once a week, and Dolores Hope just loved it. Bob Hope, famously, not so much. He was not, the modernist that his wife was. So they always had a Spanish-style house in town, and that's really where he lived. But they commissioned Lautner to build the house. Midway through construction, there was a huge fire. And so everything came to a standstill. And then, unfortunately, after they continued construction on the Hope House, Dolores Hope was making a lot of changes that Lautner did not appreciate. So he walked away from the project. And at that point, Elrod was dead, and he was no longer able to work on the interiors.
Oh, okay. He died in a car crash, is that right?
Correct, in 1974, in February. Very sad.
So what was the impact of having the Elrod house in a James Bond movie?
Well, first of all, I mean, it's pure concrete. None of this, namby-pamby wood frame for this villain.
We don't need no stinking wood, no.
Indeed. I mean, there's nothing. I mean, what better house than this massive concrete canopy, the living room? You see, when you see the clip, you see him walking in for the front, and then you see him entering the solid copper gate that was the main gate for the house. And then he comes down the pathway to these glass doors, and he walks into this circular living room, which is 60 feet in diameter. And there's Bambi, or was it Thumper?
Both.
Well, one of
Bambi
Bambi
and Thumper
lounging on the rock. So the impact visually. There's a great anecdote from Ken Adam, who was the production designer on all of the Bond films, that when he was given the house, he said, "This is as though I designed it. I don't have to do a thing." And when you see the scene, they put up a few props, things that go crashing into him, and he falls back into these like steel pipes. But otherwise, the whole thing is there. The house is laid out exactly as you see it in the movie, down to the pool where they jump in.
Those boulders are there.
The boulders were there. South Ridge. Ridge was a rocky ridge. So Laudner took what he was given and excavated down about 8 feet around the boulders so that he could, fill in with the surfaces of the living room and the master bedroom. But those boulders are a huge part of the house and a huge part of the construction and design.
Christine, did Hitchcock use modern buildings for other movies?
Definitely. Part of what I think Hitchcock was doing in the mid-century films that most of us are familiar with, like Psycho, North by Northwest, even The Birds, and of course Vertigo, what I look at is how Hitchcock was manipulating the audience experience by using the language of design. So a lot of design, we are absorbing it and we understand it even if we don't study architecture. So he would use skyscraper, for instance, to represent sort of that soulless urban life that many people were apprehensive of, excited for, but apprehensive of in the 1950s. So in North by Northwest, he uses the UN Secretariat building as the scene of a murder where people are, where the main character, Cary Grant, is actually framed and given different identity for, a murder he didn't commit, and then he's framed for it. What Hitchcock wrote about, and what you'll see, even it goes back to Louis Sullivan, who is considered the father of the skyscraper, and on some levels the father of American modernism. Louis Sullivan wrote about skyscrapers, saying that they were like one, like a beehive, a honeycomb, and it's one thing layered over another, and could be to infinity. And Hitchcock writes how he sees different stories in each of those little windows. And if you look at his work, you'll see that he uses this modern idea of the skyscraper in North by Northwest, and also, of course, in Rear Window, where he literally has a different story going on in every single window of that apartment building.
Yeah, that's a fascinating movie. It's really come back again to a whole new generation of viewers who are appreciating his work.
Yeah, I'm finding that a lot of the younger generation, I guess people who are about 20 in their 20s have not seen any Hitchcock movies at all, even though others of us grew up with that. So there's a whole new audience for trying to look at these works, and then also a new audience for trying to understand modern architecture, or any kind of architecture, the way they see it in what is really one of the most popular mediums, which is film.
Now, Adele, you were really instrumental in the early wave of new attention to Palm Springs with your book, which came out in 1999. Has it surprised you how massive this popularity has been?
Oh, it's unbelievable, isn't it? I mean, Well, Modernism Week now draws something like 70,000 people to Palm Springs over the course of 10 days. I mean, I started heading out there in the mid-90s, like 94, 95, and it was dusty. And tumbleweeds were blowing down Palm Canyon Drive, and it was a very different thing then. But I fell in love. I mean, I love mid-century modern, even though that's sort of an odd, people in the desert hate to call it that. That's why they call it desert modernism. Yes. The architects always disliked that mid-century modern term. But what they were doing there and their response to the desert and the climate and the sun and just the whole way of life there made so much sense. Because what had come before was primarily Adobe Spanish colonial revival, and it was very thick walls and red tiles. And as much as I love that style too, it was very enclosed. It feels very dark. And, here they come and they just open up the houses to the light and to the desert. And I think it's taken everyone completely by surprise at how this whole movement has grown since the mid-90s, since I call us the second wave. We're the ones who came in the mid-90s and sort of rediscover it all, and how it's become accepted, and it's just it's like miraculous.
And everybody's into it. We've learned that through our website. They're either into the houses or the furniture or the furnishings or some of the artwork or any aspect of this, because in many respects, modernism was ahead of its time and is still ahead of its time years later. One of the issues that Chris and I have talked about is that modernist houses, some of them don't look like they're old.
Indeed.
So,
yeah, exactly.
So you look at one and you talk about having a city council preserve it, and they just can't wrap their hands around the idea that this 50-year-old building is really worth saving. Right, Chris?
Yes, and what I've actually heard recently, which is compelling, is that a modern house, even built in the 1920s, could look as if it was old. It could look as if it was built right now, and it also can represent the future. And I think that shows how timeless modernist design can be. When I show people like a picture of the Health House by Richard Neutra, which was also a villain's house, which I'll talk about in a minute. But if I show it with a car that was built at the same year, the house is from the 20s. If you show it with a car, people can't believe that the house is the same age as the car. Do you see what I'm saying? Because the car looks so old and antique, and it's obviously old. One of the issues with these older homes, though, is that a lot of people who are not aware of the significance do consider them tear downs. And so that's really a big part of advocacy for modernism right now.
So tell us about the Health House.
Okay, so the Health House was also the villain's lair in LA Confidential. If you've seen that, I just rewatched it the other day. So again, it was not the hero who lived there, but the drug dealer lived at the Health House. It was actually notable and groundbreaking in its day. It was the first house built with a steel frame in the United States and was erected in only 40 hours using not really a prefab, but sort of a system of construction that Richard Neutra had developed. So there's that house, and it has those same villain qualities where it's overlooking a valley and it's very much without any decoration on it. So that house was featured. Another Lautner apparently, Adele must know this, is like the king of villain houses, right? Because so many of his works are villains' houses. The Sheets Goldstein house is in
Big Lebowski, right?
Yes, the Big Lebowski, thank you. And then also, of course, the Chemosphere is in Body Double. And Brian De Palma has often said that he was an admirer of Hitchcock. And so Body Double, a person is again framed or exposed to a murder. The Chemosphere is where the evil person lives.
And I believe it was it Lautner's Garcia house that Mel Gibson pulled down figuratively in one of the Lethal Weapon movies.
Yes, and then it was also in, I think it's called A Single Man, that had Colin Firth in it. There was another Lautner house. So his works are very popular in film.
You can see photos of all these on our website, ncmodernist.org/Lautner. Adele, you also were author of another book called Secret Gardens of Hollywood. Were there any secret gardens at modernist houses?
Yes, I'm sure there were.
You can take a minute to think about it.
It was so long ago, these brain cells. We didn't show anyone like super hugely. It wasn't about so much the architects in that book. That was more, it was really driven by the landscaping.
Okay.
And of course, yes, the landscaping with most houses goes hand in hand. That was something we were trying to show. But these were very, more modest in scale, let's say. We weren't showing major modernist houses in that book, so...
Because I don't recall the villains being very proud of their gardens.
Well, how can you be when you keep throwing people out the window and they keep trampling all over your, lawn? I mean, you can't keep those rose beds in flower for long, But the concrete, the buildings themselves are very photogenic.
Now, Tony Stark, a.k.a. Iron Man, is not a villain exactly, but his cliffside estate is clearly not built by Del Webb. What about this house, which I'm pretty sure is not a real place? Adele, Chris, what do you think of that one?
Oh, no,
ahead,
are we
Adele.
talking cartoon characters here?
The movies. This house was in all 3 Iron Man movies.
Okay.
Who designed that house?
They're sort of live-action cartoon characters.
Yes. You must have missed those on Netflix.
George, who designed those houses? I missed that part.
I don't know who the production designer was, but the Iron Man house is not a real place.
Okay.
But it completely evokes other Lautner houses.
Well, you know what I'm finding that's interesting, and I have still to investigate further, but Hitchcock actually, he had architecture was such a huge part of his films at mid-century, and even today, like with Iron Man, a huge part. What I found out was that Hitchcock had actually employed architects, and not just one or two, but he had over 16 architects had worked for him during his film career as the production designers and in the art direction. It included a lot of architects who had graduated from USC or other Southern California schools in the 1930s, and they couldn't find work as architects, so they actually went into the film industry. I'm suspecting maybe that some of that is still in play even today, that it's architects who are impacting these designs in the films.
Yes, we had as a judge for our annual George Matsumoto Prize, Nathan Crawley, who designed the modernist house in the Lake House, which is a little film with Keanu Reeves and Sandra Bullock about a decade ago. Great rental, particularly in this a month of Valentine's Day and spring. And he talked about how they actually built that house in a nature reserve. And then after it was over, they had to take it down because it was part of the agreement with the nature reserve.
It was all glass, wasn't it?
Pretty much just glass and steel. That's about all it was made out of.
Right, on stilts. But what's so funny is that when people see these things, I bet people still want to go see that house in person. It's an interesting dynamic between what people see on the film, and then they want to make pilgrimages to the sites, whether they exist or not. They want to be where the characters are. I think it's the storytelling appeal of the architecture and the movie.
And particularly with the lake house, people wanted to know, can I get plans for this? Can I visit it? And all we have now of it, unfortunately, are photos.
But that's what's so compelling about film and architecture, that something, an amazing house like, the Elrod House, which is dynamic on its own, gets so much more exposure through film. And then whenever I show photos of it with James Bond and the Bikini Warriors and they're fighting, I don't get that negative feedback about modernism that I usually get. As an advocate for modernism, I'm usually arguing with people most of the time about why something is important, but they never do that if I show them something from the movies and then talk about modernism. So I'm trying to use film as a way to get more people to understand why modernism is so important in the whole context of American architecture.
Well, I want to thank you both for coming on the show. It's been great to hear from you. Please come back anytime.
Okay.
Oh, thank you so much. This was fun.
Yeah, thanks so much.
US Modernist Radio is underwritten by Sarah Sonk, the real estate agent who loves modernist houses just as much as you do. 919-601-7339. Thanks for listening. I'm George Smart with Frank King. For the next few shows, you'll be hearing bonus interviews from Palm Springs. We'll be talking exclusively poolside with keynote speakers from Modernism Week, which was great fun. All right, take us out, Tom.
That's a dirty job, but somebody has to do it. Visit USModernistRadio.org for links about people and buildings mentioned today. US Modernist Radio is edited by Soundtracks Recording Studios in Raleigh, North Carolina. Our theme song was performed by George Smart and Robinson Earl. US Modernist Radio is a production of North Carolina Modernist Houses, a nonprofit educational archive for the documentation, preservation, and promotion of modernist residential design. I'm Tom Guild. George and Frank and I will be back in 2 weeks for another eco-friendly, LEED Platinum, surprisingly affordable edition of US Modernist Radio.